Thank you. So before I begin, I just want to say that the views in this presentation are those of the authors and not those of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. This is joint work with John Chauvin and Sita Slavov, and it's called Pathways to Retirement and the Self-Employed. Okay, so just to start with a little motivation, our project is motivated by this idea that retirement tends to be an extended process rather than an abrupt change. And we see workers reducing their hours, taking bridge jobs, and in some cases, re-entering the labor force after they've retired. So our project looks at the role that self-employment plays in this transition from working to retirement. And we think that self-employment may offer workers this flexible option for this transition. And also recently, we've seen that there's been an increase in access to self-employment through companies like Uber and Lyft, who hire people as contractors. So this method of transitioning to retirement may become important in the coming years. So the broad question that we're interested in is, to what extent does self-employment serve as a bridge job between working and retirement? And to the extent that self-employment can extend working lives, we think that there are some important policy implications for retirement security. So the specific questions we'll be looking at in this paper are what factors influence older workers' transitions to self-employment, and we're going to be looking at local labor market conditions, demographics, retirement wealth, and age effects, particularly how they pertain to Social Security. And then we also look at what happens to incomes of older workers as they transition to self-employment. So just to preview our findings, we see that around 1% of wage earners become self-employed each year, and these transitions from wage employment to self-employment take place in people's early to mid-60s. We also find that the transition to self-employment may be more pronounced for people with greater retirement wealth, which we measure as IRA balances. And this is particularly true after penalty-free withdrawals are allowed from retirement accounts. And finally, we see that there's a larger income drop for older wage earners who switch to self-employment relative to younger ones who do the same switch. And for these older workers, we see that the income drop grows with the time that they've been self-employed. Okay, so one of the contributions of this paper is the data that we use, and like the previous paper, we're also using tax data. For our analysis, we're going to take a 10% random sample of two separate birth cohorts, one that were born in 1945 and one that's born in 1965. And the idea is that the 1965 birth cohort is going to be a comparison to control for various unobserved factors that influence the employment and income transition, or employment transitions and income changes that we're focused on. But all of the analysis we're doing is still going to be descriptive. We have about 10.5 million observations that span 1999 to 2013. And so for the older cohort, this is picking up that transition from their working life to retirement, whereas for the younger cohort, it's picking up their prime working years. And finally, we're going to use data from SSA on gender and age, and then pull data from various tax forms, which are in parentheses, on self-employment income, wages, IRA balance, and household demographics. So unlike survey data, we don't know how people identify themselves in terms of their employment status. So we're going to have to infer this based on the income variables that we have. So the first thing we're going to do is define individual earnings, which is just wages from your W-2s and self-employment income from the Schedule SE. One thing to note is that the Schedule SE is used to pay payroll taxes, and so it's going to exclude anyone who has negative self-employment income, since it's not taxed. And then from that, we're going to define people who are working as those who have total earnings above $3,000. Finally, conditional on working, we separate people into those who are wage earners and those who are self-employed based on the fraction of their income that's due to self-employment. So if you have greater than or equal to 50% of total earnings from self-employment, you're self-employed, and the rest of the groups will be wage earners. So just some summary stats of our two cohorts. The 1965 cohort, as expected, has higher total earnings. They're less likely to have an IRA. The unconditional balance will be lower for that reason. And we see that a smaller fraction of the younger cohort is not employed or not working. One thing to note, though, is that within the two cohorts, we see relatively similar fractions who are self-employed. Okay. So the first thing we're going to look at is year-to-year changes between these employment states. And just for notation, the NW is not working, WE is wage earner, and SE is self-employed. The rows are going to tell you where the person started in year T, and the columns tell you where they started, or where they end in T+1, so we're collapsing all of our years of data. And we have the 1945 cohort separately from the 1965 cohort. So what we see is that there's a relatively small fraction of people who are moving from wage earners to self-employed. It's around 1%, and the same fraction is true for both cohorts. But the thing to note is that the self-employed pool is relatively small, so 1% is actually a fairly big fraction of the overall self-employed group. So just to be sure that our results aren't driven by how we defined the different employment states, we do a comparison to HRS data. And for HRS data, the transitions are more natural to do in 2-year increments, so we also did the same for the tax data. And what we find is that the transitions look relatively similar in the tax data compared to the HRS data. So that gives us some reassurance that our employment states are at least reasonably defined. Some of the differences from the HRS data to the tax data could be driven by the fact that the HRS sample is slightly older. In the paper, we do more of this comparison to HRS data, but in the interest of time, we'll only show this result. Okay, so next we're going to look at the hazard of self-employment. Here, the blue line represents the hazard of self-employment for the younger cohort, and the red line represents the hazard for the older cohort. What you see is that the hazard rises for the older cohort, and there's some jumps that seem to coincide with those vertical lines, which represent the Social Security early claiming age at 62 and the normal retirement age at 66. For the younger cohort, we see that the hazard is declining over those same years. So next we look at the hazard of not working, and we're separating the results into younger and older cohorts, but also by wage earners and self-employed people in the previous year. And for not working, we sort of interpret the younger cohorts exit from the workforce as being temporary, and so they're sort of there to capture just year-to-year changes in and out of the workforce, whereas the older cohort is more likely to be retiring. And so we're interested in that gap between the two lines. And what we see is that the gap in not working between the younger and older cohorts begins at a much earlier age for wage earners compared to the self-employed. And so we take this to be evidence that the self-employed, or people who are self-employed in their older years, may be more likely to work longer. Okay, so next I'm turning to the regression analysis, and this is basically doing exactly what we had done with the graphs, but controlling for other factors. We're going to be running a simple linear probability model where the dependent variable is going to be transitions to self-employment conditional on wage earning in the previous period, and also transitions to not working conditional on working in the previous period. So in order to control for various factors, we'll be including county level unemployment rate, which is a proxy for local labor market conditions. For our demographics, we'll be including a dummy for gender and marital status. Those are basically the only demographics that we find in the tax data, so that's one of the limitations. We'll also be controlling for earnings in 1999, and we'll use lagged IRA balance to control for retirement wealth. We'll have year fixed effects, county fixed effects, cohort effects, and then all the interactions with the cohort effects. And so we're going to be interpreting those 1945 cohort dummy and year interactions as age effects, since everybody's born in the same year. In addition, we're going to be including a 3-way interaction, IRA balance, or lagged IRA balance, year and cohort, and that's going to show us how having more wealth impacts the outcome at a given age. And finally, specifically for the not working regression, we're going to include lagged self-employment status to see how that impacts your transition to not working. Okay, so it's a lot of things in these regressions, so we're going to break it up into pieces to make it a little more digestible. The first thing we'll look at are local labor markets and demographics. And what we see is that the unemployment rate seems to have no effect on the transition to self-employment, either for everyone or for the, specifically for the older cohort. Even though that's statistically significant, it's not economically meaningful. When we look at older women transitioning to self-employment, we find that they are less likely to transition by about 2.2 percentage points. And while the magnitude of that seems small, the mean of the dependent variable is only 1.1%. So it's actually a change of about 20%, which is fairly large. We see that married people in the older cohort are more likely to transition to self-employment of roughly the same magnitude, but in the opposite direction. So overall, we're seeing that local labor markets really don't impact the self-employment transition, whereas demographics do seem to have some effects. So next we'll look at the age effects. And here we've highlighted the key parameters for, that are related to retirement. So 59.5 is when you can make penalty-free withdrawals from your IRA. 62 is the early claiming age, and 66 is normal retirement age. And what you see is, there's a lot of numbers here, but up until about age 63, most of those coefficients are 0, with the one exception of 59 that has a small, 1 percentage point, or 0.1 percentage point impact. But after age 62, you see that there's definitely an effect of age on the probability of moving into self-employment. That again ranges from about 20% to 0.7 percentage points, which is fairly large. Okay, so next we'll be looking at the impact of IRA balance on the transition to self-employment. And here we've plotted the probabilities by age, but for different levels of IRA balance. So the teal line is people who have 0 balance. The mustard line is people with a $50,000 balance, and the purple line is people with $250,000 balance. And what you see is that individuals with higher IRAs are more likely to transition to self-employment for most of the ages. Okay. So next we want to know, how does self-employment impact people's probability of not working? And once again, we have all of the same controls, but in this one we have lagged self-employment status. So as expected, if the unemployment rate is higher, we see that more people stop working. Female and marital status in the older cohorts, again, matters for that transition. But what we also see is that self-employment status is correlated with a 1.8 percentage point decrease in the probability of retirement. So it seems that people who are transitioning to self-employment may be less likely to stop working. Okay. So I skipped over the age effects in this regression because I think, older ages and more likely to stop working is pretty standard. But we do see that in our results, so that's reassuring. But what we have here are the lagged IRA balance interacted with the age effects. And for most ages, we see that people who have higher IRA balances are more likely to transition to not working. Okay, so just to sort of summarize all the results that we found in that regression, we see that older women and older singles are less likely to transition to self-employment. The probability of self-employment increases with age, particularly after the early Social Security claiming age. And as an example, we see an 18% increase in the probability at age 63. And finally, self-employment reduces the probability of stopping work, while having more retirement wealth increases the probability, increases the probability of stopping work. So together, these results sort of suggest that self-employment could be used as a bridge between working and retirement. But to get a more complete picture, we next want to look at how self-employment changes income. Okay, so we'll be looking at what happens to income of older workers when they transition to self-employment, again using the 1965 cohort as sort of a comparison group to control for other things affecting income. So in this regression, we have total earnings as our dependent variable, and we're going to include a self-employment dummy, a not working dummy, individual fixed effects, year fixed effects, and interactions with the cohort dummy. And we'll also be looking separately at those who started out as wage earners in 1999 to really pin down that transition to self-employment. So we think this is sort of the group that would be most impacted, or at least we'd see the effect most clearly. So here we have the results from that regression, and what we see is that just moving to self-employment, so I'm focusing on the wage earner in 1999 column, we see that just moving to self-employment has a $10,000 effect, a negative effect on total earnings. So this is sort of consistent with the idea that people who are starting up a business may be less successful when it first starts, or there may be some costs. But what we also see is that the interaction between moving to self-employment and the older cohort has an even greater decline in earnings. So that sort of coincides with our idea that maybe this self-employment is being used as a bridge job as people slowly transition out of working. We see the same or similar results in the full sample, but not as pronounced. So one way to try to get at this idea that maybe the decline is due to startup costs or other reasons why self-employment may be associated with lower income is to separate people by or control for the years of self-employment that they have. And so, you might expect that over time, people who are starting businesses might be more successful, but what we're seeing here is when you look at the older cohort, the years of experience is actually correlated with a larger decline in earnings. So again, this is all consistent with this idea that people are slowly transitioning out of work, and self-employment is one way that they can do that. And we see the same result in the full sample. Okay, so just to summarize, we find that older workers transitioning to self-employment experience a decline in earnings, and that's roughly half of that experienced by those who transition to not working for the full sample. But it's even more pronounced for people when we focus on those who started out as wage earners. So those are the people who would most likely be using self-employment to transition out of working. We also see that the decline in self-employment is correlated with years of prior self-employment, which is consistent with, again, a smoother transition to retirement compared to wage earners. So just to conclude, we find overall the patterns that we're seeing suggest self-employment could be a form of partial retirement for older workers or older people. But the work to self-employment path may be less common than we would expect, since we're only seeing about 1% of wage earners moving to self-employment each year. We find that a year of self-employment is much less productive than an extra year of working for an employer, where we're seeing roughly 30% less in earnings compared to wage earners. And finally, we also find that self-employment may allow workers to stay in the workforce longer, with roughly a 1.8 percentage point decline in the transition to not work.